The stranger in the velvet seat beside her had white hair that caught the projector's glow like frost catching moonlight. And when the violin swelled and the hero cradled his dying friend on that rain-soaked battlefield, Willa Dalton felt the sob catch in her throat the way it always did, the way it had caught 7 times before in this exact seat during this exact scene, because this was the part where she could finally let herself break. She turned without thinking, without permission, pressing her face into the shoulder of the man she'd only said hello to when he'd settled into the seat beside her 20 minutes into the film. And he did not flinch, did not stiffen, did not do anything at all except remain perfectly, utterly still while she wept into expensive fabric that smelled like old libraries and winter nights. The credits rolled in silence, white names scrolling against black. And still he did not move, did not check his phone, did not clear his throat or shift his weight the way people do when they want you to know your time is up. He simply existed beside her, solid and immovable as stone, until her breathing evened and she pulled back with a mortified apology already forming on her lips. "I'm so sorry. I don't usually, I do, but not on strangers. The words tumbled out in a rush, and she swiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, aware suddenly of how ridiculous she must look, 26 years old and crying like a child in a nearly empty theater over a film made before she was born. No apology necessary. His voice was deep, accented in a way she couldn't place, something old-world and careful, each word given weight. He stood then, unfolding to a height that made her crane her neck, and in the dim emergency lighting along the aisles, she saw him properly for the first time. White hair pulled back from a face that was all elegant angles and pale skin, eyes so dark they looked black, dressed in a black coat that belonged in another century. He inclined his head, a gesture that felt more like a bow than a nod, and then he was moving up the aisle with footsteps that made no sound at all. Willa sat in the empty theater for another 5 minutes, the house lights still down, the velvet curtain drawn across the screen. The Lotus Club was the kind of place that didn't rush you, a tiny members-only cinema tucked down a narrow lane off Marylebone High Street, the kind of place her brother Jamie had discovered during his first year at university and dragged her to whenever she visited London. They'd seen the last battalion here together 3 years ago, his hand gripping hers during the same scene that had just broken her, and then 6 months later he was gone. A stupid accident on a stupid rainy night, and she'd been coming back to this film ever since, because it was the last thing they'd loved together. She wasn't a member. Members paid thousands annually for the privilege, but the Lotus operated on a guest system, and she'd been signing in under a rotating cast of names she found in Jamie's old planner, friends he'd made who probably didn't remember him now, people who wouldn't notice one extra guest attendance on their account. It felt like theft a little, but it also felt like keeping him alive, keeping this one thread of connection intact in a world that had moved on without him far too quickly. The theater was empty when she finally stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder and climbing the aisle toward the exit. The Lotus was a single-screen gem, all Art Deco curves and burgundy velvet, a relic from the 1930s that had somehow survived the bombings and the developers and the endless churning hunger of the city. The lobby was small, just a narrow room with a curved bar and walls lined with framed photographs of forgotten film stars. And tonight it was deserted except for Marcus, the elderly projectionist who also worked the bar and pretended not to notice that Willa wasn't technically supposed to be here. "Same time Thursday?" Marcus asked as she passed, already wiping down the bar for closing. The Lotus ran the last battalion every Sunday and Thursday at 9:30, a schedule that never varied. "Same time Thursday," Willa confirmed, pushing through the heavy door into the October cold. The lane was dark and narrow, the kind of London street that felt like a secret, and she walked quickly toward the lights of the high street, hands shoved in her jacket pockets. She didn't let herself think about the stranger with the white hair, the way he'd sat so perfectly still, the fact that she'd cried into his chest and he'd simply let her, asking nothing, expecting nothing. It was easier to file it away under mortifying moments she'd never think about again. Except she thought about it on the tube ride home to her flat in Archway, and she thought about it the next morning at work while she stared at spreadsheets for the publishing house where she was an assistant editor, and she thought about it on Wednesday night when she should have been reading manuscripts. By Thursday evening, she had almost convinced herself not to go back, because the odds of him being there again were slim and the mortification was still fresh, But at 9 o'clock she was already pulling on her jacket and hurrying toward the tube because missing a screening felt like missing Jamie, and that was a grief she couldn't bear twice. The Lotus was busier on Thursday, almost 12 people in the lobby when she arrived, which qualified as a crowd for a place this small. She signed in under a name from Jamie's planner, accepted a glass of wine from Marcus with a grateful smile, and slipped into the theater just as the lights were going down. Her usual seat was taken, so she moved 3 rows back, settling into the velvet and trying not to scan the shadows for white hair. The film began the way it always began, with that sweeping orchestral score and the slow pan across the battlefield at dawn, and she let herself sink into it, into the familiar rhythms of dialogue she could recite, and scenes that felt like muscle memory. She made it to the 50-minute mark before she saw him. He was sitting in her usual seat, the one she'd occupied on Sunday, his white hair unmistakable even in the darkness. Something about that made her chest tighten, though she couldn't say why. The sad part was coming, the third act turn where the hero's best friend took the bullet meant for him, and she felt the tears building the way they always did, hot and inevitable. She tried to stay quiet, biting down on her lower lip, but the sob broke free anyway, and then she was crying again. Here in the darkness surrounded by strangers, because Jamie had loved this scene, had talked for hours about the way the score mirrored the hero's realization. And God! She missed him so much it felt like drowning. Someone pressed a handkerchief into her hand. Not paper, but real cloth, heavy and monogrammed. She looked up through blurred vision and saw him standing in the aisle beside her row, the white-haired stranger, his expression unreadable in the flickering light of the screen. He didn't say anything, just waited until she took the handkerchief, and then he moved back to his seat without a word. Willa clutched the fabric in her fist and cried until the scene ended, until the hero was screaming his friend's name into the rain, and then she pressed the handkerchief to her face and tried to breathe. The film continued. The stranger did not look back. She stayed through the credits again, and when the house lights came up, she folded the handkerchief carefully and walked down the aisle toward him. He was still seated, hands resting on the arms of the velvet chair, watching her approach with eyes that were too dark, too still. "Thank you," she said, holding out the handkerchief. "I'll wash it and bring it back." "Keep it." His voice was just as she remembered, deep and old and careful. "You'll need it next time." "You think I'll cry again?" It was meant to be a joke, but it came out too raw, too honest. "I think you come here to cry," he said, which was such a true and terrible thing to say that she actually laughed, a startled sound in the empty theater. "You come here a lot too, then? To this particular film?" She was still holding out the handkerchief, but he made no move to take it. "Every screening." He stood, and again she was struck by his height, the way he moved like water, like something not quite human. For 3 years now. The same amount of time she'd been coming. The same amount of time since Jamie died. She wanted to ask why, what kept bringing him back to this story, but the question felt too intimate for 2 people who'd barely exchanged a dozen words. Instead she said, "I'm Willa. Beaumont Xanthus." He pronounced it with the same care he gave everything else, and then he inclined his head in that strange little bow and walked past her toward the aisle. She watched him go, the handkerchief still warm in her hand, his name foreign and beautiful in her mind. The next Sunday, she arrived early, before the lights went down, and found him already in her usual seat. He glanced up as she approached, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touching his mouth, and then he gestured to the seat beside him without a word. She sat, aware of the warmth of him even through the space between them, aware that this was becoming something, though she couldn't say what. The film played. She cried. He remained perfectly still beside her, and when she turned into his shoulder again, it felt less like an accident and more like a homecoming. This became their pattern. Sunday and Thursday nights, 9:30 showings, the same 2 seats. He never spoke during the film, never shifted or checked his phone, just sat in that preternatural stillness while she fell apart beside him. Sometimes she cried into his shoulder, sometimes she kept her grief to herself, but he was always there, solid and unchanging, and slowly the mortification faded into something else, something that felt almost like trust. After the Thursday screening in the 3rd week, he waited for her in the lobby while she gathered her things. Marcus was locking up the bar, and the last few patrons were filtering out into the cold, and Beaumont stood by the photographs on the wall with his hands in his coat pockets, studying a picture of someone Willa didn't recognize. "Do you want to get coffee?" she asked, the question surprising her as much as him. "Or tea? Or just walk? I feel like I cry on you twice a week and I don't know anything about you except your name and the fact that you have excellent taste in tragic war films." He turned to look at her, and in the lobby's low light she could see his features properly. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled, eyes so dark they swallowed light. Beautiful, in a way that was almost frightening. "I don't drink coffee," he said finally. "Tea then, or nothing. Just walk with me." She didn't know why it mattered, why she suddenly needed to know him beyond the darkness of the theater, but the need was there, insistent and urgent. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "One walk," he agreed. They left the Lotus together, stepping into the narrow lane. It had rained earlier and the cobblestones gleamed, reflecting the single street lamp at the corner. Willa pulled her jacket tighter and started walking, trusting him to follow. He did, his footsteps silent beside hers. "Why this film?" she asked after a block. "You said you've been coming for 3 years, every screening. That's a lot of viewings." "The score," he said simply. "The music was written by a friend of mine, a long time ago." "The composer?" Willa tried to remember the name from the credits. "Julian somebody?" "Julian Thorne. He died before the film was released. The studio wanted to replace his work, said it was too melancholy, but the director fought for it. The Last Battalion was the only film that ever used Julian's music." Beaumont's voice was soft, almost distant, and he kept his eyes on the street ahead. "I come to remember him." Oh, that was a grief she understood. "I come from my brother," Willa said, the confession easier than she'd expected. "Jamie. He loved this film. We saw it together here at the Lotus 3 months before he died. Car accident. Stupid and quick and so unfair I still can't breathe around it sometimes. The film is the last thing we shared, and when I watch it I can almost pretend he's still here, still in the seat beside me, still holding my hand during the sad parts." They walked in silence for a while, winding through the streets toward Marylebone Station. The city was quiet at this hour, the theaters emptied out, the restaurants closing down. Above them, the sky was orange with light pollution, starless and vast. "Julian would play the piano until dawn," Beaumont said eventually, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. "His flat was above a bookshop in Bloomsbury, and I would sit in his kitchen while he worked through compositions, smoking his terrible cigarettes and drinking worse whiskey. He wrote the score for The Last Battalion in 3 weeks, fever-pitch work, barely sleeping. He said the story haunted him, the idea of loving someone enough to die in their place. He wanted the music to feel like grief and devotion at once." "He succeeded," Willa said. "That scene where the friend dies. The music makes it unbearable in the best way. You can feel the hero's heart breaking." "Yes." Beaumont stopped walking, and Willa realized they'd reached the station entrance. "Julian died a month after he finished recording. Heart attack. He was 31. I tried to convince the studio to keep his work, but I had no legal standing, no leverage. The director was the one who fought for it. I never thanked him properly. I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, but she meant them. "It's not the same, but I'm sorry you lost your friend." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes were so dark and deep, she felt like she might fall into them. "You understand," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I understand," she agreed. He walked her to the tube entrance and left her there with another of those small bows. And Willa rode home thinking about grief and music and the strange man who came to the same film every screening for 3 years just to hear his dead friend's work. There was something beautiful and terrible about that kind of devotion, something that made her own grief feel less lonely. The next Sunday, she brought flowers, cheap daisies from the shop near her flat, and left them on the velvet armrest of Beaumont's seat before the film started. When he arrived 5 minutes before the opening credits, he stopped and stared at them for a long moment, and then he picked them up with a carefulness that made her throat tight and held them in his lap through the entire screening. After, in the lobby, he thanked her with a formality that felt like an embrace, and she knew without asking that he'd take them home, that they'd end up in water somewhere in his flat, tended until they died. They fell into conversation after that, small exchanges in the lobby before and after screenings. She learned that he lived in Highgate, that he'd been in London for a very long time, that he rarely saw films besides this one. He learned that she worked in publishing, that she liked her tea with too much sugar, that her brother had wanted to be a composer like Julian Thorne. The pieces of their lives came out slowly, carefully, like neither of them wanted to disturb the delicate thing growing between them. In November, the Lotus announced on its website that the last battalion would be taking a hiatus from the schedule for the month of December due to print damage. Willa saw the notice at work and felt something like panic close around her throat. She'd been coming to this film for 3 years, twice a week, every week. It was the only place she let herself grieve openly, the only place where Jamie still felt real. The thought of that being taken away, even temporarily, made her want to scream. She arrived at the Thursday screening, intending to ask Marcus if the hiatus was permanent, if there was any chance they'd bring it back in January, and found Beaumont standing in the lobby looking like a man carved from ice, his face a mask of controlled fury. Marcus was behind the bar, hands up in a placating gesture, explaining something in a low, urgent voice. "What's wrong?" Willa asked, moving to Beaumont's side. "The print is damaged beyond repair," Marcus said before Beaumont could answer. "The studio that owns the rights went bankrupt in the 90s, and the negatives were lost. The print we have here is one of maybe 3 surviving copies in the world, and it's deteriorating faster than we can preserve it. We can't keep screening it. Another few months and it'll be gone entirely." "So restore it," Willa said. "Digitize it, remaster it, whatever they do with old films." "That costs hundreds of thousands of pounds," Marcus said gently. "The Lotus doesn't have that kind of money. We're barely staying afloat as it is." Beaumont had gone very still, the way he did during the sad parts of the film, and when he spoke his voice was soft and dangerous. "Who owns this theater?" "Technically, the Xanthus Trust. Has for decades. But the Trust's administrator makes all the decisions, and he's been trying to sell the building for years. Thinks it's a waste of prime real estate." Marcus looked miserable. "There's a developer sniffing around now, Rothwell Holdings. They want to turn the whole block into luxury flats. If they make the right offer, the administrator will take it." "Over my dead body," Beaumont said, and something in the way he said it made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Willa stared at him. "The Xanthus Trust? Are you related to—" "I own the trust," Beaumont said flatly. "Or I did before I appointed an administrator to handle the more tedious aspects of property management, a decision I'm currently regretting." He turned to Marcus. "Tell me about Rothwell Holdings." Marcus hesitated, then sighed. "They've bought up half the block already. Office building to the north, the old restaurant to the south. They're offering well above market value, pressuring holdouts. The administrator has been fielding calls for months. Word is they have deep pockets and no patience." "Then they'll learn some," Beaumont said, and walked out of the lobby into the night without another word. Willa looked at Marcus. "Is he always like that?" "Mr. Xanthus is a very private man," Marcus said carefully, "but he cares about this place more than anyone realizes. If he says the Lotus won't be sold, I believe him." The film screened anyway that night, a possibly last hurrah, and Willa cried harder than she had in months, mourning not just Jamie but the impending loss of this ritual, this sacred space. Beaumont held her through it, his arm coming around her shoulders properly for the first time, and she buried her face in his chest and let herself shatter, because if this was ending, she wanted to break completely just once. Afterward, he walked her all the way home to Archway, a journey that took over an hour on foot. They didn't talk much, just walked through the cold November night while the city glittered around them. At her building's entrance, she turned to face him, taking in the sharp angles of his face, the white hair that seemed to glow under the streetlights. "Are you really going to save the Lotus?" she asked. "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt. "Because of Julian's score. Because some things should not be allowed to disappear just because the world has forgotten them." He reached out slowly and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers were cold, but the gesture was unbearably gentle. "Your brother deserves to be remembered. Julian deserves to be remembered. The stories that matter deserve to be protected." "You're a good man, Beaumont Xanthus," Willa said, and then, because she was tired and sad and tired of being sad, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. He went rigid under her touch, every muscle locking, and she pulled back immediately. "Sorry, I didn't mean. Don't apologize." His voice was rough, strained in a way she'd never heard before. "But you should go inside now, please." She went, glancing back once to see him still standing under the streetlight, watching her door with an intensity that should have frightened her, but didn't. That night she lay in bed holding his monogrammed handkerchief and wondering what it meant that she was falling in love with a strange, formal man who sat through the same film twice a week and never once looked away when she cried. The Lotus did not screen The Last Battalion on Sunday. Willa went anyway, unable to break the habit, and found the theater dark, a handwritten sign on the door apologizing for the closure. She stood in the narrow lane feeling unmoored, unsure what to do with her Sunday evening now that the ritual was broken, and was about to leave when Beaumont appeared from the shadows like he'd been conjured from her thoughts. "Come with me," he said without preamble. "Where?" But she was already moving toward him, pulled by something she didn't want to examine too closely. "Somewhere I should have shown you weeks ago." He led her around the back of the building, down a service alley she'd never noticed, and produced a key that opened a nondescript door. Inside was a narrow stairwell, and they climbed in silence, up and up until Willa's calves burned. The stairs ended at another door, and this one opened into a cavernous space that took her breath away. It was the projection room, but calling it that felt inadequate. The room was huge, lined with metal shelves that held hundreds of film canisters, and in the center sat the projector itself, a beautiful mechanical beast that looked like it belonged in a museum. But what made Willa gasp was the piano in the corner, an upright covered in dust, and the photographs covering one entire wall, pictures of a young man with dark hair and laughing eyes, sitting at pianos, holding cigarettes, caught in moments of joy and concentration. "Julian," she said, moving toward the photographs, "I had them moved here after he died. The Lotus was supposed to be temporary, just until I decided what to do with his flat, but then it became permanent. This whole theater became his memorial, in a way." Beaumont stood in the center of the room, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the photographs with an expression of profound loss. "I bought the building in 1947. It was a bombed-out wreck. I rebuilt it, reopened it, made sure The Last Battalion played here regularly so Julian's work would never be forgotten. It's the only thing I've ever done that felt like enough." 1947. That was nearly 80 years ago. Willa turned to stare at him, doing the math, and the numbers didn't make sense unless, "How old are you?" she asked. Beaumont met her eyes across the room. "Old enough to have learned better than to want impossible things. Old enough to know what it means to watch everyone you love turn to dust. Old enough to have stopped hoping for something different right up until you turned into my chest and cried, and I realized I'd been waiting centuries just to hold you." The words hung in the air between them, too big and too true to take back. Willa's heart was hammering against her ribs, her mind racing through impossible explanations, but only one thing made sense of his stillness, his cold skin, the way he moved like something not quite human. "You're a vampire," she said. "Yes." He didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched her with those fathomless dark eyes. "I have been for nearly 400 years, Julian knew. He was the last human I allowed myself to care for, and I buried him in 1893. I swore I would never do that again, never let myself want someone I would inevitably lose. And then you appeared in my theater, weeping for your brother, and I broke every promise I'd made to myself." Willa should have been afraid. Should have run, should have screamed, should have done anything except stand there, feeling her heart crack open with something that felt absurdly like relief. Because this explained everything, his formality, his stillness, the way he seemed to exist slightly outside of time. And it didn't change the fact that she'd been falling in love with him for months, slowly and inevitably, in the darkness of the theater and the quiet of their walks. "You fell first," she said, remembering his words. "You said it like it was a confession." "It was." He took a step toward her, then stopped, like he didn't trust himself to come closer. "I fell the moment you let yourself be vulnerable in front of a stranger. I fell watching you grieve with your whole heart. I fell because you understand what it means to lose someone and refuse to let them disappear. You keep coming back to the same film, the same ritual, because love doesn't end just because life does. That kind of devotion is rare, precious, and I have wanted you since that first night with a desperation that terrifies me. I'm going to die, Willa said, because it seemed important to name the obvious. Someday, not soon hopefully, but someday, and you're going to have to bury me the way you buried Julian. Is that something you can survive? No, Beaumont said honestly. But I've spent 400 years surviving, and I'm tired of it. I want to live, with you, for however long you'll have me. She crossed the room to him, closing the distance he wouldn't cross himself, and took his cold hands in hers. The developer, she said. Rothwell Holdings. They're going to fight you for this building, aren't they? Almost certainly. And you're going to fight back. Absolutely. His fingers tightened around hers, careful of his strength, but not alone, not anymore. Tell me what you need, Willa said. What he needed, it turned out, was proof that the Xanthus Trust was being mismanaged by its administrator. Over the next 2 weeks, Beaumont and Willa spent their evenings in his Highgate house, a gorgeous Victorian manor hidden behind high walls and older wards, combing through decades of financial records. The administrator, a vampire named Cassius Thorne, who claimed to be Julian's distant relative but almost certainly wasn't, had been systematically selling off trust properties for years, pocketing the profits through a shell company that fed back into Rothwell Holdings. He's working with the developer, Willa said, highlighting another suspicious transaction. Has been for at least a decade. Every property he sold has ended up in Rothwell's portfolio. Which means Rothwell isn't just a developer, it's a front. Beaumont leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. They were in his study, a room lined with books and maps and artifacts from centuries Willa couldn't fathom. Cassius wants me out, wants control of the trust completely. The Lotus is the last property he hasn't managed to take because I specifically forbade him from touching it. But if I don't act soon, he'll find a legal workaround. So we remove him as administrator. You're the trust's founder, you have that power. In theory. In practice, vampire law is complicated. Cassius has allies on the council, old families who've never liked me. If I move against him without ironclad proof, they'll accuse me of paranoia and tie the trust up in legal proceedings for years. He opened his eyes, looked at her with something raw and afraid. I can't lose the Lotus, Willa. It's all I have left of Julian, and now it's where I found you. I will burn the city down before I let Cassius take it. We'll find the proof, Willa promised, and we'll do it without arson, preferably. They worked late into the nights, and Willa learned what it meant to exist in Beaumont's world. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, moved through his house like a ghost haunting his own life. He was gentle with her always, careful never to let his strength slip, never to let her see the darker parts of what he was. But she saw them anyway, in the way his eyes tracked her pulse, in the tension that gripped him when she stood too close. He wanted her, she realized, not just emotionally, but physically, in the way vampires wanted humans, and he was holding himself back with a control that must have cost him dearly. You can feed from me, she said one night, the words spilling out before she could reconsider. They were sitting on the floor of his study, surrounded by paper, and he went absolutely still. If you need to, I trust you. No. The word was hard, final. I don't feed from humans anymore. Haven't in over a century. I use blood banks, donations. It's safer. Safer for me or for you? Both. He looked at her, and his eyes had gone black, bottomless. If I started, I don't know if I could stop, and I will not risk you, Willa, not for anything. She let it go, but the knowledge sat between them, heavy and charged. She wanted him too, wanted him with an intensity that should have frightened her, wanted to know what his mouth tasted like, what his hands would feel like on her skin, whether he was as controlled in passion as he was in everything else. But she didn't push. There was too much at stake, too many battles to fight before they could afford to think about their own desires. The proof they needed came from an unexpected source. Marcus, the projectionist, appeared at Beaumont's door one evening with a box of documents and a nervous expression. Mr. Xanthus, I think you should see these. I was cleaning out the basement storage at the Lotus and found them behind a false wall. Letters, contracts. Some of them have Cassius Thorne's signature. The letters were damning. Correspondence between Cassius and Rothwell's CEO, a vampire named Sylvanus Drake, detailing their plan to acquire the Lotus and demolish it. More than that, they outlined a larger scheme. Cassius had been selling trust properties to Rothwell at a fraction of their value in exchange for a percentage of the development profits. It was embezzlement on a massive scale, and it had been going on for 30 years. "This is enough," Beaumont said, his voice shaking with fury. "This is more than enough to have him removed and charged." "So we take it to the council?" Willa asked. "We take it to someone I trust on the council. And then we prepare for war, because Cassius will not go quietly." The Vampire Council met in a building beneath Whitechapel, a labyrinthine complex of chambers and halls that had existed since the 1600s. Beaumont brought Willa with him, despite protests from the council guards, and she stood beside him in a stone room lit by candles while he presented his case to a panel of ancient vampires who looked at her like she was livestock. The council leader, a woman named Lilith Corvinus, who appeared no older than 30, but radiated power like a furnace, reviewed the documents in silence. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "These are serious accusations, Beaumont. Cassius Thorne has served the community for decades. You understand we cannot move against him lightly." "I understand that he's been stealing from me for 30 years and you did nothing to stop it," Beaumont said coldly. "I understand that he's working with a developer to erase vampire-protected properties, and you've allowed it to happen under your watch. What I don't understand is why you're hesitating now that I've handed you proof." "Because Cassius has friends, Beaumont, friends who will argue this is a personal vendetta." Lilith leaned forward, eyes glittering in the candlelight. "And because you've brought a human into our affairs, that complicates things." "The human has a name," Willa said, her voice echoing in the stone chamber, "and I'm the one who helped find this evidence, so maybe show a little gratitude instead of looking at me like I'm dinner." Several of the council members hissed, but Lilith laughed, a sharp, delighted sound. "She has spirit." "Very well, Beaumont. We'll summon Cassius and Sylvanus Drake for questioning, but I want your word that you'll abide by our ruling, whatever it is." "You have it," Beaumont said. The hearing took place 3 nights later, and it was brutal. Cassius arrived with a lawyer and a sneer, denying everything despite the evidence. Sylvanus Drake was smoother, claiming the transactions were legitimate business dealings and that Cassius had acted within his rights as administrator. They were both compelling, both confident, and Willa felt her stomach sink as she watched the council members whisper among themselves. Then Beaumont stood and began to speak, his voice ringing through the chamber with a power that made the candles flicker. He talked about Julian, about the music, about the importance of preserving beauty in a world that devoured it. He talked about trust, about duty, about the fact that he had appointed Cassius in good faith and been betrayed, and he talked about Willa, about grief and memory and the human capacity for love that endured past death. It was a speech that should have been melodramatic, but in his voice, with his conviction, it became something transcendent. When he finished, the chamber was silent. Lilith looked at Cassius with cold eyes. "You are removed as administrator of the Xanthus Trust, effective immediately. The properties will be returned to Beaumont's direct control, and you will repay every penny you've stolen. Sylvanus Drake, Rothwell Holdings is barred from operating in council-protected zones. If you contest this ruling, we will consider it an act of war." Cassius lunged then, moving with vampire speed, aiming for Beaumont's throat. He didn't make it 3 steps before Beaumont caught him by the neck and slammed him into the stone floor hard enough to crack it. For a moment, Willa saw the predator beneath the gentleman, the creature who'd survived 400 years through strength and ruthlessness, and it was terrible and beautiful at once. "You will never touch what's mine again," Beaumont said softly, and then he released Cassius and stepped back, his control sliding into place like a mask. The council guards dragged Cassius away, still snarling threats, and Sylvanus Drake vanished into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. Lilith approached Beaumont and Willa, her expression almost approving. "You've made enemies tonight, Beaumont. Powerful ones. I hope she's worth it." "She is," Beaumont said, not looking away from Willa. "She's worth everything." They left the council building and walked through Whitechapel in the early hours before dawn. neither of them speaking. Willa's hands were shaking, adrenaline and fear and relief all tangled together. They'd won. The Lotus was safe, the trust was secure, and Cassius was ruined. But the look on Beaumont's face when he'd pinned Cassius down kept replaying in her mind, a reminder that the man she loved was also a monster, and those two truths would always exist in tension. "I frightened you," Beaumont said finally, stopping in the middle of the street. The sky was lightening to gray, and he looked exhausted in a way she'd never seen before. "A little," Willa admitted, "but not in the way you think. I wasn't afraid you'd hurt me. I was afraid of how much I wanted you to hurt him. Is that wrong?" "It's human." He reached for her hand, hesitated, then took it anyway. His skin was cold as always, but his grip was gentle. "Violence is not foreign to you, Willa. You've just never had cause to embrace it. But if someone had hurt Jamie, you would have wanted blood. That's not wrong. That's love." "Is that what tonight was? Love?" "Yes." He pulled her closer, and in the gray dawn light she could see every angle of his face, every year of his immortal life written in his eyes. "Everything I do now is love. Every choice, every fight. I told you I fell first, and I meant it. I have been in love with you since the moment you trusted me with your grief, and I will love you until the world ends or I do. That's not a question anymore. The only question is whether you can love me back, knowing what I am." Willa looked at this impossible man, this vampire who'd rebuilt a theater as a memorial, who sat through the same film 100 times just to honor a friend, who'd fought his own kind to protect something beautiful. She thought about the way he held her when she cried, the way he never asked her to be anything but broken, the way he'd looked at her in the council chamber like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "I already do," she said. "I love you, Beaumont. I think I have since you gave me your handkerchief and told me I'd need it again. And yes, it's terrifying, and yes, I know it ends badly because I'm mortal and you're not, but I don't care. I want however much time we have." He kissed her then, finally, a kiss that was gentle and desperate at once. His mouth was cold, but he tasted like winter nights and old books, and when his hand came up to cup her face, she melted into him, into the impossible reality of being loved by something that shouldn't exist. They stood in the empty street kissing while the sun threatened on the horizon, and Willa felt like she'd finally come home after years of wandering. "I need to get inside," Beaumont murmured against her lips. "Sunlight." "Come home with me," Willa said. "My flat has blackout curtains. You'll be safe." They took a taxi to Archway, racing the dawn, and stumbled into her flat with minutes to spare. Beaumont sealed the curtains with the efficiency of long practice, and then they were alone in the darkness, the city waking up outside while they existed in their own private night. Willa made tea she knew he wouldn't drink, just to have something to do with her hands, and when she turned around he was standing in her tiny kitchen, looking impossibly out of place, this regal vampire in a space filled with mismatched mugs and Jamie's old books. "Tell me about him," Beaumont said, nodding toward the photograph on her fridge. Jamie at graduation, grinning in his cap and gown. So she did. She told him everything. Jamie's terrible jokes, his obsession with film scores, the way he'd always ordered too much food at restaurants because he hated the idea of someone going hungry. She told him about the accident, the phone call, the funeral where she hadn't cried because the grief was too big to fit into tears. And she told him about the first time she'd come back to the Lotus alone, how she'd sobbed through the entire film and felt like Jamie was there with her, just out of sight. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "He would have thought you were impossibly dramatic, but he would have liked you. I wish I could have met him." Beaumont set down his untouched tea and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. She went willingly, resting her head against his chest, listening to the silence where a heartbeat should be. "Thank you for sharing him with me." They moved to her bed eventually, not for sex but for closeness, lying tangled together while Beaumont told her about Julian. About the first time they'd met in a coffee house in Bloomsbury in 1886, Julian playing piano for coins while Beaumont sat in the corner pretending to read. About the years of friendship that followed, Julian's laughter and brilliance, and the way he'd never feared what Beaumont was. About the morning Beaumont had found him dead in his flat, still sitting at the piano, a composition half finished on the music stand. "I kept the pages," Beaumont said softly. "The last thing he wrote. It's incomplete, unplayable." but I can't let it go. Maybe it's not supposed to be complete, Willa said. Maybe it's perfect exactly as it is because it's his last words. Beaumont held her tighter, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him shake with something that might have been sobs if vampires could cry. They fell asleep like that, Willa drifting off to the sound of his unnecessary breathing, Beaumont lying still and watchful as the day passed beyond the curtains. When she woke it was evening, and he was gone. But there was a note on her pillow in elegant handwriting. Gone to deal with the Lotus restoration. Come to the theater tomorrow night. I have something to show you. She spent the day in a daze, barely focusing at work, her mind full of kisses and confessions, and the impossible reality of being in love with a vampire. By the time she arrived at the Lotus the following evening, she'd half convinced herself she'd dreamed the whole thing. But Beaumont was waiting in the lobby, dressed in a black suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of another century, and the smile he gave her when she walked in was real and warm and entirely hers. Come, he said, offering his hand. He led her into the theater, and she gasped. The space had been transformed. The screen was down, the velvet curtains drawn back, and the seats had been cleared from the center to make room for a small table set with candles and flowers. But what made her throat close was the piano on the stage, a beautiful grand that definitely hadn't been there before, and the single film reel sitting on the table. I had the print restored, Beaumont said. Cost a fortune and called in every favor I had, but it's done. The last battalion will screen here for as long as the Lotus stands. Your brother's favorite film, Julian's score. They'll both be remembered. Beaumont. She couldn't find words big enough for what she was feeling. And I thought, before we screen it for the public again, we should watch it ourselves, just us, the way it should be. He gestured to the table. I can't eat, but I had Marcus bring food for you. And afterward, if you'll allow it, I'd like to play something for you. Julian's last composition. I've been practicing. Willa crossed to him and kissed him hard, trying to pour everything she felt into the press of her mouth against his. When she pulled back, they were both breathing hard, and his eyes had gone black with want. You're perfect, she said. This is perfect. Yes to all of it. They sat at the small table and she ate while he watched, his gaze tracking every movement with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but wasn't. Then Marcus appeared in the projection booth, gave them a thumbs up, and the lights went down. The film began, that familiar sweeping score, and Willa settled into her chair feeling like something long broken inside her was finally mending. She cried during the sad part, the way she always did, but this time Beaumont moved his chair closer and pulled her into his arms properly, letting her turn her face into his chest while he held her with a tenderness that felt like a promise. They stayed like that through the end of the film, through the credits, through the silence that followed, and when Willa finally pulled back, her face was wet, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Thank you, she whispered, for understanding, for this. Always, he said, and kissed her forehead. Then he stood and moved to the piano on stage, settling onto the bench with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Julian wrote this the week before he died, Beaumont said, his hands hovering over the keys. It's called Elegy for the Living. I don't know if he meant it as his goodbye, but that's what it became. I've never played it for anyone, he began, and the music filled the empty theater like a living thing. It was sad, yes, but not only sad. There was joy in it too, and longing, and a fierce determination to celebrate beauty even in the face of loss. Willa listened with her whole heart, hearing Julian in every note, hearing Beaumont's love in the way his fingers moved across the keys. When the last chord faded, she was crying again. But these were different tears. These were grateful. She went to him on the stage, and he pulled her down onto the bench beside him, his arm around her waist. Play it again, she said. But this time, tell me about him. About Julian, every memory. I want to know him the way you did. So he played, and he talked, and Willa listened to the story of a friendship that had spanned years and ended too soon, a friendship that had shaped the man, the vampire she loved, and somewhere in the middle of the third playing, with Beaumont's voice soft in her ear and his hands bringing Julian's music to life, Willa realized this was what healing looked like. Not forgetting, not moving on, but making space for grief and joy to exist together, honoring what was lost while embracing what remained. When he finished, she turned to face him on the narrow bench. "I have an idea," she said. "What if we did this regularly? Not just screen the film, but host memorial screenings for people who've lost someone and need a place to grieve. We could make the Lotus a space for that. Keep Julian's music alive, keep Jamie's memory alive, and help other people do the same." Beaumont stared at her, something like wonder crossing his face. "That's brilliant. That's yes, we'll do it. However often you want. The Lotus can be a sanctuary for grief, for memory, for love, for all of it," Willa agreed. They started the memorial screenings in January. Once a month, the Lotus would host a special showing of The Last Battalion, open to anyone who'd lost someone and needed to cry in the dark. Willa made a website, spread the word through grief counseling groups and online forums, and Beaumont quietly funded scholarships in Julian's name for young composers. The first screening drew 15 people. The second drew 30. By March, they were turning people away, the tiny theater packed with mourners who wept through the sad parts and stayed for tea and conversation afterward. Willa met Sarah, a woman who'd lost her wife to cancer. She met Thomas, a father whose son had died in the war in Syria. She met dozens of people carrying griefs that mirrored her own, and slowly, surrounded by their stories, she felt the sharp edges of her loss begin to smooth. She would always miss Jamie, that would never change, but the missing became something she could carry instead of something that carried her. Beaumont watched all of this with quiet pride, standing at the back of the theater during screenings, a pale guardian in the darkness. He and Willa became the Lotus's strange, devoted caretakers, the odd couple who ran memorial nights and refused to let grief be invisible. People whispered about them, about the formal man who never ate, about the young woman who cried every single screening, but mostly people were grateful. The Lotus became known as a place where sorrow was honored, where it was safe to break down, where healing could begin. In April, Willa moved into Beaumont's Highgate house. It made sense practically, her lease was ending, and she was spending most nights there anyway, but it felt like more than convenience. It felt like building a life together, strange and impossible as that life might be. She filled his dark halls with plants and laughter, and he filled her days with devotion and the kind of steadiness she'd been missing since Jamie died. They fit together in ways that surprised them both, the mortal and the monster, the grief-stricken editor and the vampire king who'd learned to want again. Their physical relationship deepened slowly, carefully, both of them aware of the danger. Beaumont was terrified of losing control, of hurting her in passion, and Willa had to coax him into intimacy with patience and trust. The first time they made love, he trembled against her like he might shatter, his control wound so tight she could feel it vibrating through him. But she gentled him with hands and words and the steady beat of her pulse, and when he finally let himself go, it was beautiful and fierce and safe, because he loved her too much to be anything but careful. Afterward, lying tangled in his sheets, she traced the line of his jaw and said, "You won't break me, you know. I'm stronger than I look." "I know," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her palm, "but I've spent centuries learning to be gentle. Let me cherish you the way I need to." So she did, and their relationship became a dance of trust and desire, each of them learning the other's limits and needs. He fed from blood banks and never from her, though she saw the hunger in his eyes sometimes when her pulse jumped. She wore high collars on memorial nights when the theater was full of strangers, and he stood close enough to make it clear she was claimed. They built a life in the spaces between mortal and immortal, and somehow it worked. Summer came, and with it, the 1-year anniversary of Willa's first visit to the Lotus. Beaumont marked the occasion by screening The Last Battalion on a Sunday afternoon, just the two of them, recreating that first night when she'd cried into his chest, and he'd gone still with wanting her. This time, when the sad part came and the tears started, she turned into his arms, knowing exactly where she belonged, and he held her like he'd been made for nothing else. "I love you," she said into his chest, the words muffled against expensive fabric. "I love you, and I'm not afraid of how this ends. However long we have, it's enough." "It will never be enough," he said, his voice rough, "but it will have to be, and I will love you until the stars go dark, Willa. That's my promise." She tilted her head back to kiss him, and they stayed like that through the credits, through the silence, through the moment when Marcus knocked gently on the theater door to ask if they wanted him to lock up. They went home to Highgate hand in hand, and Willa felt Jamie's presence beside her like a blessing, approving and warm. Her brother would have loved this, she thought, would have loved seeing her happy, loved seeing the lotus thrive, loved the impossible romance that had bloomed in the darkness of grief. That night, curled against Beaumont's side in the huge bed they now shared, Willa said, "Tell me what forever looks like for you, without the sad parts, just the good." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "Forever looks like this," he said finally. "You, here, in my arms. The lotus filled with people remembering their loved ones. Julian's music playing somewhere in the world. That's all I've ever wanted. All I'll ever need." "And when I'm gone?" she had to ask, had to know he'd survive the grief that was coming. "When you're gone, I'll keep living because you asked me to. I'll run the memorial screenings in your name. I'll make sure your brother is never forgotten, the way I made sure Julian was never forgotten. And I'll wait however long it takes to see if there's anything after this that might let me find you again." He kissed her temple, soft and lingering. "But until then, I'm going to love you with everything I am. No holding back, no protecting myself. Just love, pure and complete." Willa felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears, the kind that came from being understood so completely it hurt. "I'm so glad I cried that night," she whispered. "So glad you were there." "So am I," Beaumont said. "So am I." The years that followed were some of the best of Willa's life, though she knew they were borrowed fragile things. She watched herself age in the mirror while Beaumont stayed frozen, eternal and pale. She tried not to think about the day when the gap between them would become unbridgeable. Instead, she focused on the present, on the lotus and its growing community, on the love she and Beaumont built in quiet moments and grand gestures, on the way grief could transform into something beautiful if you gave it space and time. They traveled sometimes, always to places where Beaumont could move safely at night, always returning to London and the theater that had become their shared heart. They visited Julian's grave in Highgate Cemetery, and Willa left flowers there the way she left them on Jamie's grave in Manchester. The two men, one she'd never met, one she'd lost too soon, became entwined in her mind, guardians of the love she'd found in their absence. On a cold November evening, 5 years after they met, Beaumont took Willa back to the Lotus for another private screening. The theater had been renovated again, the seats restored, the screen upgraded, but it still felt like the same sacred space. Marcus was retiring after 40 years as projectionist, and this was his last screening, a gift to the two people who'd saved the place he loved. They sat in their usual seats, Beaumont and Willa, watching the last battalion for what must have been the 200th time. When the sad part came, Willa cried as she always did, and Beaumont held her as he always did, and Marcus watched from the projection booth with tears in his own eyes, because he understood what they'd built here, a temple to memory, a refuge for the broken-hearted, a place where love survived past death. After the credits rolled, Beaumont stood and pulled a small box from his coat pocket. Willa's heart stuttered as he opened it, revealing a ring, a simple band of white gold set with a dark sapphire that matched his eyes. "I can't give you immortality," he said quietly. "I won't make you what I am, because you're too bright to belong to the darkness. But I can give you this. My name, my devotion, every day I have left with you. Marry me, Willa. Make me the happiest creature in existence for however long we're granted." "Yes," she said, laughing through tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her there in the empty theater, and Marcus applauded from the booth, and somewhere in the dark, Willa felt Jamie's joy and Julian's approval, the ghosts of the past blessing the future. They married in the spring in a small ceremony at the Lotus, surrounded by the grief group community they'd built, officiated by a friend of Beaumont's who'd been ordained sometime in the 1500s. It was strange and perfect, human and vampire traditions blending, and when they exchanged vows, Willa promised to fill his immortal life with as much love as she could hold, and Beaumont promised to carry her memory forward long after she was gone. Their marriage was happy in the way that all good love stories are, full of small joys and quiet devotions, laughter in the kitchen and comfort in the dark. Willa thrived at the publishing house, eventually becoming an editor specializing in memoirs and grief literature, while Beaumont expanded the Lotus's programming to include film preservation workshops and composer fellowships. They were partners in every sense, building something that would outlast them both. The decades passed more quickly than Willa expected. Her hair grayed, her face lined, and Beaumont stayed frozen at the age he'd been turned, beautiful and unchanging. She caught him sometimes staring at her with such fierce longing it broke her heart, and she knew he was trying to memorize her, to hold on to every version of her aging self. On their 20th anniversary, when she was 46 and he was 400 and change, she sat him down in their Highgate study and said, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," he said immediately. "When I die, and it will be soon, in your timeline, if not in mine, I need you to keep living. Really living. Not just existing the way you did before we met. Keep running the Lotus. Keep helping people grieve. Maybe even let yourself fall in love again, eventually, if you can bear it." She took his cold hands in her warm ones, holding tight. "I'm not asking you to forget me. I'm asking you not to bury yourself with me." "Willa," his voice cracked, the most uncontrolled she'd ever heard him. "Promise me," she insisted. "Promise you'll fight for joy the way you fought for the theater. Promise you'll believe that good things can happen more than once." "I promise," he said finally, the words dragged from somewhere deep and bleeding. "But you should know that nothing will ever compare to you. No one will ever be what you are to me." "I know," she said gently. "But that's okay. Love doesn't have to be the same to be real." She lived 15 more years. Long enough to see the Lotus become a landmark, long enough to publish a memoir about grief in cinema that became a bestseller, long enough to feel like she'd done something meaningful with the time she'd been given. And through it all, Beaumont was beside her, constant and devoted, holding her through the aging process with a grace that never wavered. On the night before she died, and she knew it was coming, could feel her body shutting down, all the machinery finally wearing out, she asked him to take her to the Lotus one last time. He carried her there in his arms, moving through the London streets with vampire speed, and settled her into their usual seat with infinite care. The theater was dark, closed for the night, but he went up to the projection booth himself and threaded the film, and then The Last Battalion played one final time for an audience of 2. Willa cried during the sad part, her tears slower now, her body too tired for sobs, and Beaumont held her the way he'd held her that very first night, perfectly, utterly still, his arms a sanctuary. She pressed her face into his chest and listened to the absence of his heartbeat and felt nothing but gratitude for the strange, impossible love they'd built. "Thank you," she whispered when the credits rolled. "For all of it. Every moment." "Thank you," he answered, his voice wrecked, "for teaching me how to want again, for loving me despite what I am, for every film, every tear, every second I got to hold you." She fell asleep there in his arms, and she never woke up. Beaumont sat with her body through the rest of the night, through the dawn that crept around the edges of the theater's blackout curtains, perfectly still the way he'd learned to be across centuries. When Marcus arrived in the morning, he found them there, the vampire and his mortal wife, frozen in an embrace that looked like a sculpture, like something too beautiful to be real. He buried her next to Jamie in Manchester because she had asked him to, and he stood at her grave in the rain and finally let himself break. He'd survived 400 years of loss, but this one nearly ended him. Only the promise he'd made to her kept him moving forward, kept him returning to the Lotus and running the memorial screenings and helping other people survive their grief. It took decades before the sharp edges dulled, before he could watch The Last Battalion without feeling like he might shatter. But eventually, he learned to carry Willa's memory the way he carried Julian's, with honor, with love, with the determination to make sure they were never forgotten. The Lotus continued to thrive, becoming known worldwide as a place of healing and remembrance. Beaumont ran it for another 100 years, always keeping Willa's programs alive, always making sure her vision endured. And on quiet nights, when the theater was empty and the city slept, he would sit in their usual seat and remember the woman who'd turned into his chest and cried, the woman who'd taught him that stillness could be a gift, that holding someone through their pain was the highest form of love. He never remarried, though he loved again eventually, a writer who reminded him of Willa's fierce heart, a musician who made him think of Julian's brilliance. Nothing ever compared, just as he'd known it wouldn't. But it was good and real and enough. Because Willa had been right. Love didn't have to be the same to be meaningful. And he'd promised her he'd keep living, really living, so he did. Centuries later, when the world had changed beyond recognition and the lotus had become a protected historical site, Beaumont would tell visitors about the two people who'd shaped it. Julian Thorne, the composer who'd scored The Last Battalion, and Willa Dalton Xanthus, the editor who'd turned a theater into a sanctuary. He'd tell them about grief and memory and the importance of holding space for pain. And sometimes, when he was alone, he'd play Julian's unfinished elegy on the theater's piano and remember both of them. The friend who'd died too young, the wife who'd taught him joy. But his favorite memory, the one he returned to across all the long years, was that first night. A stranger crying in a dark theater, the decision to hold her instead of looking away, the way she'd turned into him without fear, and he'd gone perfectly, utterly still, knowing even then that his life had just changed forever. Everything good that came after the love, the partnership, the years of happiness had started with that single moment of vulnerability and response. So he kept the Lotus running, kept The Last Battalion screening, kept making space for people to cry and heal and remember. Because that's what Willa would have wanted. That's what she'd built with him. A legacy of love that refused to let grief be the end of the story. And as long as he existed, as long as he drew breath he didn't need, her name would be remembered, her vision would endure, and the theater where they'd found each other would remain a sanctuary for the broken-hearted. Stillness, he'd learned, was not the absence of feeling. It was the presence of absolute devotion. It was holding someone through their pain without asking them to explain or perform or hurry up and heal. It was being so certain in your love that you didn't need to move, didn't need to speak, just needed to be there, solid and unwavering, a place to break down and a place to rebuild. That's what he'd given Willa during the sad part of the film, and what she'd given him in return. Permission to be still, to hold and be held, to love without fear of the inevitable ending. And though she was gone now, dust and memory, the love remained, solid as stone, enduring as the old theater where it had begun. On the 500th anniversary of his turning, Beaumont stood on the Lotus's stage and played Elegy for the Living one more time, his hands moving across the keys the way Julian had taught him centuries ago. The theater was full of people who'd come to mourn their own losses, and as the music swelled sad and joyful at once, grief and celebration braided together, he felt both of them with him, Julian and Willa, the two people who'd made his immortal life worth living. The last chord faded into silence, and Beaumont sat with his hands resting on the keys, perfectly still in the way that had become his signature. He thought about the title of Julian's piece, Elegy for the Living, and realized it had been prophecy. Because this was what it meant to survive loss, not to forget, not to move on, but to live fully in honor of those who couldn't, to carry their love forward, to remain still and strong so others had a place to break. He was a vampire king who'd learned not to want, and then he'd learned to want again, and then he'd learned to keep wanting even after loss. That was the greatest gift Willa had given him. The knowledge that love was always worth the grief that followed, that holding someone during the sad parts was enough, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply not move, not turn away, not let go. So he kept sitting there at the piano. The vampire who'd made a theater into a temple, the king who'd learned stillness was its own form of strength. And in the silence after the music, surrounded by grieving strangers who'd found sanctuary in the dark, Beaumont Xanthus finally understood what it meant to be alive. He held her during the sad part of the film, and she cried into his chest, and the vampire king never moved, not because he was cold or distant or unfeeling, but because he loved her too much to do anything but bear witness to her pain, to be the solid ground beneath her breaking, to prove that some things endured past death and time and all the grief the world could hold. That was the story. That was the love. That was enough.